Zanele, let's get started. Introduce ourselves. My name is Graham Codrington, and Zanele, I'll introduce her in a moment. And I are from a company called Tomorrowtoday. We're a group of people. We call ourselves futurists. That doesn't mean we can predict the future. I wish we could. Nobody can do that. But what we do is track trends. We have a look at how the world is changing, the disruptive forces that are shaping the world around us. And well, what could be more disruptive than the times we're living in right now? And we have spent the past week introducing different members of our team, having conversations with our team around the issue of disruption, and especially the issue, obviously, of the COVID-19 crisis and the disruption. Earlier in the week, we had a look at how to deal with anxiety and stress. We got one of our team who is a psychologist to help us think that through, looking at different personality types. We then had a look at cultural issues. People using the opportunity of being in a crisis and anxiety to maybe drop some of the filters that they've had, and to maybe be culturally inappropriate. And culture in that case, not just being race and ethnicity, but corporate culture and gender and generational issues. People are stressed and maybe not engaging with others as they should. We talked that through with my colleague Boothler. And then on Thursday, our colleague Dean, who is a cancer survivor, talked about what he had learned through going through cancer and fighting against cancer, as to what that means for dealing with any type of disruption in our world. And today we are going to be looking at the issue of unlearning. Zanele Njapa is one of our team based in South Africa, but working internationally with all of our clients on this topic of unlearning. It's not a word that we made up, it's a word that's been around for a while. And it really just talks about the fact that if you want to learn something new, you can't just add on new information to your old information. Sometimes you have to unlearn some of your habits, some of your actions, some of your thinking, so that you can make space for new learning. And we have worked over the last number of years with many organizations and leaders around the world, helping them to understand what that really means. And of course, unlearning is something that's really, really important in the area of disruption. When you are being disrupted, when your world is no longer the same as it was, unlearning becomes an essential skill. No more introduction needed than that, right? And I'm going to hand over to Zanele to give us a little bit more insight into unlearning, and to take it from here. She's the expert, so I'm just going to chip in whenever I've got questions and whenever you've got questions as well. So now that you've all used the chat box to introduce yourselves, thank you very much. We've got a wonderful group of people from all over the world joining us today, and I'm going to watch that chat box. So if you have questions as we go along, we'll be able to take those questions, and I'll dip in, Zanele, and interrupt you with the questions that were being asked. One final point to make, and that is that this webinar will be recorded and you will have access to the recording. I'll put the link now into the chat box. It's Tomorrowtoday Global, all one word, tomorrowtodayglobal.com. Just follow the link to the webinars, and you will be able to pick up all of the past webinars that we've done. They're all available for free, all on replay, and you will be able to go and get those, share them with friends. We are wanting to make this information. We think that the work that we're doing at Tomorrow Today around disruption and learning about disruption is going to be very useful to you, and you can go and share this information to your friends. Now, talking about disruption, you'll see that Zanele has left the room. This happens every now and again when our internet connections go a little bit crazy, and so I'm just going to check in with her and just make sure that everything's okay on her side, and that she can just get back in a second. Let me just, while I'm talking here, let me just put in that link for you so that you can share all of our existing webinars with everybody else. So there it is in the chat box for you now. While we're waiting for Zanele to come and get back in the room, let me just hear from you and use the chat box to do this. If I say the word to you, unlearning, is this a phrase that's familiar to you? And if it isn't familiar, or if you've just heard the word around, what does unlearning mean to you? If I were to say to you that unlearning is an essential skill that you are going to need in the future of work, what does that make you think of, and what jumps to your mind? What do you think is part of the skill of unlearning? I am nervous that Zanele's internet has died on her because I'm not able to get hold of her. Okay, but she says she's getting back in. But you answer my question in the chat box right now. What does unlearning mean to you? Excellent. Zanele, if you'll just get your video and your audio going again.
Thank you. Sorry. If that happens to anyone else, just log out and then log back in.
Exactly. We were talking about disruption, right? So I think you just gave us a live demonstration there.
Precisely.
You'll have to watch the video again to see how much padding I had to do. Zanele, I've just asked people to just tell us a little bit about what unlearning means to them. You might just want to quickly have a look at the chat box.
All right.
And have a look at that, and then you can pick up things again. Don't forget.
Looking for better ways to do things, disrupt yourself. Precisely, and I like the one of disrupting yourself, because I mean, we get disrupted all the time, and COVID-19 is such a perfect example of that. And if there's anything that unlearning is about, it's about moving from one normal to a completely different normal, and then making that transition in the most smooth way possible without breaking a sweat. So this is not something that's easy, but it is something that we have to do. So while I just wait for my slides, let's just see. Letting go, I love that.
There we go.
Thank you. All right. So who's ever had a moment where you just come into a situation, you thought you were well prepared, and then boom, everything changes. Like you think you're ready for a webinar, and then boom, your internet just abandons you. So we all go through these types of moments on an ongoing basis, and especially at work. I have a term that I like to use with a lot of my clients, and I call it the Weet-Bix effect. Now, if you're in the UK, for you, this will be Weetabix. But if you are anywhere in South Africa, if you are in New Zealand, Australia, and even China, we call these Weet-Bix. And the reason why I call this the Weet-Bix effect is because with Weet-Bix, bless this cereal, I absolutely love it. You'll put the milk in, turn around to put the milk back in the fridge, and you come back and everything is completely changed. Everything is completely different, and it's not what you left it as initially. So this is why I call this the Weet-Bix effect. And it's something that is happening to us quite a bit at this time, and this is what disruption actually feels like. It feels like you go into a state of innovating or working on something, you put your head up, and everything is completely different from what you initially thought it was. So a lot of you really just hit the nail on the head with that one. A lot of people have been saying, and I've been hearing this, Graham, I don't know about you, people have been saying, I can't wait for this to be over so we can all just go back to normal. Can't things just be normal already? And unfortunately, I've got bad news for you, that there is no normal. There is no normal for us to go back to. And this is currently our new normal. We need to understand that disruption in any form, and a lot of the time with non-tech disruptors, we may not see it as such, but disruption as a whole will change the way we live, the way we work, and the way we relate to each other. So normal, as it were, actually changes completely. Think about it. Graham, we made a joke about this the other day. The children that are going to be born in 2-3 years from now, and even 9 months from now,
I think lots of children are going to be born 9 months from now. Different story for another day. So yeah.
Those children are going to come into a world where what we're experiencing moving into now is going to be normal. So that's going to be normal for them. And when you start to think of it from that angle, you realize that this is not just something that we're going through. This is literally a transition in the way that life works, in the way that we relate to each other, in the way that our businesses operate, and in the way that we actually interrelate with our world. Now, so there's no normal to go back to. And then this is how actually normal gets created, is when there's some form of disruption that occurs, it calls us to actually pivot and change the way that we do things. Now, here's a little trick.
Zanele, before you get to that, I just really want to reiterate that point for people, because many of the industries that people have been in, and a lot of the people tuned into this webinar are obviously business people looking for ideas and help in a crisis. Many of your industries, people, were already being disrupted. I mean, we've spent the last number of years working with industries and individuals to help them think about technology disruption and global trade partnership disruption and social disruption, changes in the social system. So at one level, yes, COVID-19 is a massive imposed disruption that causes deep changes to the way that the world works. At another level, it's just one of a series of disruptions that we were all experiencing, and some of your industries were about to experience deep destructive disruption anyway. And I think this is the point, isn't it, Zanele, that yes, of course, we're in the middle of a deep global crisis, but at another level, we're just at a time in history where everything is going to be disrupted anyway. And this is what excites me about your topic, Zanele, is that now everybody understands what we mean by disruption, because you don't have a choice. But actually the mindsets that we need to develop to get through COVID-19 are mindsets that are going to be very, very valuable for the rest of our lives, actually, because we're going to be living disrupted lives forever, whether it's COVID-19 or technology or societal shifts or anything else. This is the normal we now live in, right?
Precisely. Absolutely right, Graham. So it becomes, like you said earlier, it becomes a lot less about the crystal ball and what the future looks like, to saying let's rather engineer a culture of consistent disruption, which is what UnLearning is. It's self-disruption, so that our organization is built on the culture of continuously disrupting ourselves, so that whatever the future does end up looking like, we are ready to continuously move into.
And that tells us, exactly, and that tells us that disruption isn't always negative. Sometimes a disruption is hugely negative and difficult, and it breaks things and it feels bad. But other times disruption can be good and positive, and it can allow us to leave things in the past and to have a blank slate and to start into the future. And I think COVID-19 is going to be both of those. It is definitely a bad thing, and it's definitely destructive and disruptive. But it also gives us the opportunity to do good things and to change things and to take the opportunity of a blank slate. But to do that, we're going to need some of these mindsets. So sorry, you said that there was something you wanted to do with us here, so I interrupted.
Yes. All right, so I would like everyone to just have a look at the phrase that I'm about to put on the screen. Now tell me what this phrase means to you, or how do you interpret this particular sentence? Time flies like an arrow. What does that mean to you? What are the things that come into mind when you think of that? What could that possibly mean? So Graham, I'll just start with you while everyone heads to the chat box. What does that mean to you? What are the interpretations you can think of? Time flies like an arrow.
I think, I suppose for me, and honestly, my brain works this way, Zanele, and I know you too. So you're trying to trick us a little bit, I'm sure, and I can't work out what the trick is. So for me, it's just that it moves quickly and it moves in a straight line. That's what I'm saying. So time, when I say it, I mean time.
Yes.
Moves in a straight line and it moves quite quickly.
I see most people also are thinking along the same lines. Duke, time waits for no one. It goes quickly. I see Evangelos also go back to go forward. That's a bit of interesting thinking there. Speed, one direction, but everyone's along the same lines. And what happens here Life is short. Ah, yeah, how did you get to that? All right, that's interesting. See, I love this activity because it shows us just how different people actually process pieces of information. And this is a very important part of unlearning. Now, the fact that you saw, and this is what happens with most people, you actually see a picture of an arrow or even a clock in your head when you think of this phrase. That's showing us that there's actually a very well-developed set of schemas or schema within your head about any kinds of words and phrases or even images that you have. But think about this. Did anyone think about this interpretation? Time flies like an arrow. Did they think about how you can actually time, like the action or the verb? Time flies like an arrow. So you would actually time flies the way you would time an arrow. Anyone think about that?
So in other words, you're saying that flies is a noun and we should time the flies as they fly around. Like
precisely, performing the action of timing on the flies the way you would perform it on an arrow.
Yes. So it's an instruction. It's an instruction for me to time the flies like an arrow.
Yes. And the other one, let's see if anyone got this one. If time flies were a kind of fly. So think about time flies as a noun to describe a kind of fly, and that they like or maybe prefer or are attracted to arrows or an arrow.
So there's a whole lot of these flies that are called time flies that are swarming around an arrow because they like it a lot.
Precisely, yeah.
I knew there was a trick.
So yes, it was a bit of a trick. But the point of that, and I love to use these because it shows us exactly what our brains like to jump to. And this is what happens with unlearning and creates this kind of mental block in our minds when we try to move from one pattern of behavior or even one concept or one kind of business model to another. There's this kind of shift and we feel like we're hitting this kind of wall that we can't seem to break away from. Now, let me just give 3 examples of what this could be. So this is called fixedness, and it can come in 3 different forms. The first form is functional fixedness. So functional fixedness means that you can't seem to see an item or anything of the such functioning in a different way from the way that it already functions. So the function of something can't possibly be different from the way that you see it. Now, let me give a quick example. When I was a teacher, I was a primary school teacher for a bit of time. A little boy that I used to teach had a little matchbox. And when I saw him take this matchbox out, I completely freaked out. But I found out that he was actually using this matchbox to put his Vaseline to moisturize his lips with. And that for me was a form of how he'd broken away from functional fixedness. So the function that something could perform could be pivoted or could be changed in his mind. The next form of fixedness is structural fixedness. So the structure of something, the structure that something takes, this could even go to extend it into things like routines, schedules, and this type of thing. So the structure that something has, a lot of the time we can't see something structured differently. It's just something in our minds that struggles to see a structure changing. The last one is relational fixedness. Relational fixedness is quite self-explanatory. This is the one that says we struggle to see things relating to each other in a completely different way. This could be the relationship people have with each other, different parts or functions within the business. We can't see them relating to each other differently, or the impact. So think about the impact that something could have on another. So there's just no way that we see these things relating to each other in a completely different way. Any questions on that before we move on? Flies like poop. Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting from you, Michael.
I saw that too from Ben. You can have a little bit of fun in the chat box as well. I think keep going, Zanele, and if any questions or comments come up, I'll let you know.
Cool, not a problem. So here's the last trick of the presentation. Have a look at this picture and tell me what number parking lot this car is parked in. Try to do it as quickly as possible. Don't give yourself too much time to think. What is the number of the parking spot covered up by this car? So once again here, and I think that you've sort of caught my flow here is that you need to self-disrupt. And a lot of the time we look at things at face value and we think that it is what we see it to be. So unlearning really is about coming out of those restrictions that we've built up over time. And we're going to look at a little bit of the neuroscience, but all of those habits that we've looked at. All right, Craig Lee, I see you say 9, Suresh 99, Peter 87. Okay. 108 meter. Okay. Now have a look at this. Does this change your answer at all? Now you'll notice that after having just swiveled the image around or flipped over, our vantage point or our perspective is completely different. And this is the challenge with unlearning. It's about shifting your perspective, and not just shifting it, but challenging it. I love to encourage a kind of challenging stance or mentality when it comes to unlearning. So your brain can unlearn. When I work with a lot of my clients, I go, oh no, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's virtually impossible. We've been working, and how many of us hear the phrase, this is how we've always done things at so-and-so corporation. We can't change things, or sit down, don't suggest anything different because this is how we've always carried things out. So that's what we really want to move away from. And the great news is that your brain actually can unlearn. You are capable of unlearning. Think about your brain.
Can I just interrupt you there? Because that, I think, answers a question that Duke asked a moment ago. Are these patterns of thought wired into us? And I suppose that can mean, are they wired in at birth? So are they part of things that are like our personality and our physical characteristics? Are they genetic? Or maybe are they wired by our culture and our experiences? And then I'm guessing the follow-up question is, are they fixed as well? Mm-hmm. And you've I think you've answered that, but just, it was a question that was asked, so maybe you can just reiterate. These are not fixed, are they?
No, they're not at all, Graham. So think about your brain as a forest. If you want to get from point A to point B and there's no formed path to get there, what you have to do initially to create that path or to start walking that path is it does come with some form of difficulty. But what happens in your brain is something very similar. So the more you travel this particular path in the forest that's thicketed with trees, the clearer the path starts to become. And you can start to think of this path as a kind of tarred path over time. So it becomes so much easier to travel, and then so much more something you don't even think about later on. But what happens is we all have all of these kinds of neural pathways within our brain, and we've all heard cells that fire together hardwire together. It means that every time you fire some kind of alert, and there's a similar response in your mind that fires because you've created this neural pathway. But if you want to start to move to either a new habit, a new way of thinking, all you have to do is to start creating a new path. Now, it's not something easy to just move from the path that is actually tarred because you've traveled it so long. And people will say it takes more than 250 days to create habits. A lot of people will say 21 days, which is actually not true, because if you're thinking about a habit that needs to replace something that's been your default, unless it's something like drinking water in the morning, it's not going to last you. So you want to get it to a part where it's actually the new default, the new normal. So it would take you a lot longer than that. So you just introduce the new pathway within your brain. And then each and every time that request is fired, so every time your brain says, okay, I'm going to get up, then the response, the new response that you've set needs to be the very first one you remind yourself that you've created. And then the more you travel that new path, what happens is in your brain is that the old path starts to prune away because it's now not being used. Remember, cells that don't fire together will then unwire, and then that's how you make the other part obsolete. But it is something that your brains can do, fortunately.
So Zanele, that's what happens inside my brain and your brain, and so I can take some control over doing that. The unlearning piece is stopping going down old paths, deliberately putting a roadblock, if you like, using your analogy. But the same thing is true inside teams and organizations, right? That there might be policies and procedures, or actually more likely, what a good friend of mine, Steph Duplessis, calls unwritten ground rules. In other words, these are the things that are not written down. They are the way things are done around here. And when you're new in a team, you normally are on high alert to work out how things are done around here. So, for example, people might connect with this one. Around here, the meeting after the meeting is the most important meeting. If you know what I mean by that. Around here, we don't really need to get to the meeting room on time because we always start late. Or around here, I only get spoken to by the boss when something's gone wrong. So it might not be formal policies and procedures, those exist as well, but a lot of these pathways you're talking about are the way things are done in our organization. And if we need to change the way that they're done, we not only have to spend some time making new pathways, in other words, doing it differently, we also have to work hard to make sure that everybody in the organization recognizes there's a no entry sign to the old pathway. I love your forest pathway analogy. And that's unlearning, right? It's putting up the no entry signs to the old pathways.
Yes, very well explained, Graham. And I always say that the best way to know if disruption is our culture is to listen to the water cooler conversation, which is the culture that's not on the wall. It's the culture that we do practice, the culture in the WhatsApp groups. That's the real thing. Okay, let's move right along. Now we're going to get into those 3 mindsets. I want to just emphasize here that the reason why we've paired a mindset that we need to unlearn with a mindset that we need to relearn is because of exactly how our brains work. So we need to introduce some kind of alternative in order for us to be able to make that transition in the best way possible. So these are the 3, and we'll just jump quickly into them because I do want to engage a little further on each one as we go along. From denial to curiosity, from silos to systems, from panic to opportunity. And now these are the 3 critical mindsets that we are going to need to shift between as we move through a crisis. And it's not just during this time. Graham mentioned a little bit earlier that we work with clients around disruption, and this is consistent. This is what we always do. It just so happens, and I also said this to a lot of people, that now everyone kind of understands the work that I do, but it's consistent. So any form of disruption at any time, this is something key mindset shifts that we all need to make. Now let's start with the very.
Sorry, I'm just going to take you back a slide here quickly, just so that I can get this exactly right. So if people are saying, yes, I recognize that we're living at a time of disruption and recognize that maybe we disrupted all the time, but at least it's now front of mind. This is what you're saying that we have to work on. So I might be denying the disruption. I've got to learn some curiosity. I might be in a silo mindset. That means I might be stuck in my function in my part of the world. I've got to learn a systems mindset. And I might be engaged with panic or fear or anything, and I've got to shift the mindset shift to opportunity. Have I understood exactly? Is that right?
Okay. Yeah, that's correct, Graham. Okay, we're going to get into a little bit more detail now.
Okay, perfect. I'll let you go for it. Go for it.
Cool. First one, from denial to curiosity. So for denial, what we can say, instead of maybe using the word denial, which might strike an easier chord with most people, is distraction or uncertainty. So during times of disruption, there's a form of uncertainty that goes around within most people, and we get distracted. So I like to use the head in the sand kind of analogy, where we stick to sources of information that we trust, Now, here's the thing with those sources of information that we trust. They may not necessarily be credible or correct, but in times of crisis, in times of disruption, what people tend to do is we speculate. So if there's any kind of information that's missing in our scope of information, we will fill in the blanks in some type of way. And we'll stick to what we know. We stick to the people that we know. So imagine if I told you a piece of information first, and then things start to change later on, just like with COVID-19, right? We're starting to establish and to learn more information on this virus. But if you are in this state of denial, what you'll do is you'll stick to the first piece of information that you heard, and it'll be a little bit difficult for you to move out of that. So what we want to encourage here is moving from this mentality into a mindset of curiosity. And curiosity, within our 8 skills at Tomorrow Today, we'll call this horizon scanning. So it's looking out and scanning the horizon and asking yourself, what do we know? What do I actually know? This is a great start off before even asking yourself what you need to know. Ask yourself, what do you know at this time? And this is something organizations can do. What are we aware of? Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. So unless you put yourself into a position where you start to know better and expose yourself to better information, then you can actually make this move. Another thing here.
Just to cut in there, there's another huge problem with this that we also have to recognize, and that is the issue of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is one of the most powerful processes of your brain. Your brain is designed and evolved, whichever language you prefer, your brain exists to confirm the things you already believe. So the things you know produce beliefs about the world around you. And as part of the way your brain is structured, is your brain is absolutely desperate to prove yourself right. And any piece of information that comes into your world, which conforms to what you already believe, your brain puts a big tick mark next to it and says, look how clever you are, Graham. You know, somebody else has now confirmed what you believe, and you also ascribe cleverness and all the rest to the person who gave the information. On the flip side, if you get new information and that information is something that contradicts what you already believe, your brain will reject it initially, and it will probably ascribe some kind of negative attribute to the person who gave that information to you. They're an idiot, they don't know what they're talking about, they're a moron, whatever, they're wrong, and your brain protects itself from information that doesn't conform to what you already believe. This is not whether you're stupid or clever. This is not how much knowledge you've got. This is not how much you've studied. This is true for everybody. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest dangers, especially in a time of crisis and panic, is that you don't interrogate your own beliefs. You don't accept and open yourself up to new information. And it is really one of the most important parts of learning about unlearning, is to be skeptical, if you like, of your own thoughts. Mm-hmm. You can't question everything you think, and you can't question everything you believe, but you do need to be open to thinking, but what if I'm wrong? And what if there's another way of looking at this? And that, for me, I think, Zanele, it's easy for people to say, must I be more curious? What does that actually mean? Must I just ask a few more questions? No, it's actually also part of asking, well, what if I'm wrong? And how does the world work? And are there other ways of looking at the world? So there's a lot of depth to this issue of curiosity. It's not just asking a question. Would you agree with that? Do you think that we should really look at confirmation bias as part of this unlearning process?
I agree, because a lot of the time what we do is we look at our known variables. And now this is especially in organizations. We look at the things that we know, the things that impact us as an organization directly. And then we fail to then look around that what that's called is weak signals. And when you take anything from that perspective, then there's so much more that you're not aware of that could potentially impact you. So it's that consistent mindset. One thing I heard was this consistent mindset of intentional naivety. So taking on a stance of what if I don't know, as you said, and then prodding further into that. And now let's move into the next one. Silos into systems. So from an isolation type of perspective or state of being into a systemic mindset or acknowledgement of the way that things work. So silos would not just be restricted to thinking about me and my family at this time. Let's all hoard the toilet paper at Pick and Pay because, you know, this is what we need. Let me get this for my team. My function needs this type of thing. But it actually goes beyond just the person type of perspective. It also goes into linear thinking. When we think about things in a very linear type of way, if A, then B, if Z, then C, and it's always one way or the other way. Now, where this comes from is a kind of self-preservation type of signals. We want to continuously preserve ourselves. And so it's easy for us to, especially in times of crisis, to jump into a silos kind of mentality. Is my family okay? Is my group doing okay? If marketing is not doing well, then maybe so-and-so who's part of the marketing team hasn't pulled their weight. If there's something wrong with the product, manufacturing. But what we want to do during times of disruption that will help us to actually unlearn where we want to go from into where we want to go to is to take on a systems kind of mentality. So with systems, it's all about dealing with complexity. We work with human beings, and I mean, there's nothing, Graham, and I think you'll agree with this, there's nothing as complex as the human being. Further into that, we work in these different kinds of systems that we've created around each other. So it doesn't serve us to think in a linear kind of way when we want to actually better understand a systemically built kind of individual. So when something is complex, it literally just means that there are different systems that come together and are sort of juxtaposed to help you to understand that. And unless you start to look at everything with that in mind, then it's not easy for you to start to understand the whole. And that also goes into understanding the different parts of the system and how they interrelate. You start to think differently about ownership. You start to own the things that happen. So like with COVID-19, it's so easy, and Wule said this earlier this week, that it's so easy to ascribe the blame. But when you take on a kind of systems mentality, you understand that humanity as a whole can take the blame for this. There are so many things that have been interrelating within this system that may have caused this to jump out at us. And one final thing about systems that I want to say, Graham, and then I want to let you come in here, is interrelationship. With systems, you then start to also understand the relationship that different parts of the system have with each other. And this is critical when it comes to innovation. We don't do enough. I always say we don't do enough kind of cross-functional interrelation within our businesses when we want to innovate. We work in these kinds of silos, and then we don't understand why our products at the end are sort of creating some kind of backlog or some kind of mess somewhere along the line. But it's important that we create this kind of systems and cross-functional thinking in order to move from there. Anything you want to say to chip in there, Graham?
Yeah, I think, Zanele, just from a practical perspective, you know, I think a lot of people don't realize how siloed, and I hope people understand that word now, you've explained it well, but how siloed they are in their business work. And I think they might be discovering it now as they work from home, and they're now sort of physically isolated from their teams and their offices. They might suddenly realize how isolated they actually are from the whole organization. When you're sitting in a building and you've got an office space and people are moving in and out, you kind of, sometimes the silos are a little bit invisible because you feel like you're part of a team, and you feel like you're getting information flowing. But now that we're all isolating and self-isolating in our homes, I think it becomes a lot clearer that silos are really damaging because we don't get all the information we need. We're not in touch with the whole system of the business that we're in, and that even in the team that we're in. And this moment is giving us a massive opportunity to think through the fact that we are part of a system. We're not just a little cog, and all we need to concentrate is on our little cog piece. actually, the more everybody in our team understands the whole system, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Graham. I was just looking through the chat box. Thanks for handling that. I see a lot of people are engaging quite well. That's lovely. Let's move on to the last one. So the last set of mindset shifts that we need to create is from panic to opportunity. And I put this one last purposefully. Aren't we just panicking at this moment in time? And we know that when we panic, there's this lovely rush of cortisol and we're not able to think straight. So there is almost no way that you can think clearly and actually start to devise solutions when you're in a state of panic. So whether it's fright, flight, fight, or freeze, there is a response there that doesn't allow you to think clearly. And this adrenaline that's pushing you to act is going to push you to act in a way that hasn't been thought out clearly and doesn't actually have some form of clear thinking behind it. So what you want to do is you want to calm the panic. And the only way to actually calm the panic is to start to understand your situation. And that's literally all it is. I mean, you can do breathing exercises, and this works quite well, but the perspective is actually one of the best ways to come out of any state of panic. When you take a better view of your situation, you take it in and you understand it from a different vantage point and for what it actually is and what it actually has to offer you. So start to relook the change. And I want to suggest that we do this using those 3 types of fixedness. The structure.
Before you get back to that, just let me add to this at this point, Zanele, and that is right now, for example, in the COVID crisis, wherever you are, different parts of the world are in different parts of the curve at the moment. But all of us are kind of struggling to work out what happens next. Yeah. And I think a simple practical thing for us today, just as you're listening to this, is to realize that we can't go back to normal. This is where you started this morning, Zanele, is to say a lot of people are sitting in lockdown. So I'm guessing most of the people who are watching us are sitting in a lockdown situation, or they've got a shelter-in-place order in the United States. And you kind of just, it's this moment where you're anxious. You don't know if your job's going to be there, if your company's going to be there. You may be worried about loved ones who are locked down on the other side of the world and might be getting sick. And there's this panic and anxiety and stress and fear and whatever words you're using. But at the back of your mind, you're hoping that this is just a very short-term thing. You're hoping it's a few weeks, and then you're going to be released from lockdown. We saw this, Zanele. What was it, 2 days ago, our president in South Africa announced lockdown's going to be extended. And a whole lot of people are just losing their minds now and saying, why do we have to, go further? We're going to break the economy too much and people are going to be messed up. And I think the reason for that is that they had pinned their hopes on something which was never going to happen. And they hadn't looked at the horizon and got new knowledge in to realize there's no ways that lockdown is going to last for 3 weeks. Every country that's had lockdown in the rest of the world has had to extend their lockdowns. China locked down for 11 weeks. And then when lockdown is finished, it doesn't just finish. People need to start thinking, what does the end of lockdown look like? The government doesn't just say, lockdown is finished, everybody go back to work tomorrow. We don't have a vaccine for this disease yet. We're only going to get a vaccine 12 to 18 months from now. So for the whole of 2020, even if lockdown is finished, we're going to have to keep social distancing. We're not going to be squashing into shopping centers and movie theaters and aeroplanes. And your company might have to only allow 1/3 or half of the people to come back to the office for the rest of 2020. I am not going, personally, I don't think I'm going to get on an airplane in 2020 when there's no vaccine available. How do you do social distancing on an airplane? International travel might be shut down for 6 to 12 months. And so, I don't know, some of you might have just spat your coffee out or needed to take a seat in hearing that. But this is the point, right? If we bring false hope to people, if we just sort of pretend that nothing's really being disrupted, we haven't done the unlearning piece. And the unlearning piece about COVID-19 is there is no normal to go back to in 2020. Whether lockdown lasts a few weeks or not, the rest of 2020 is going to be significantly disrupted. And so now, panic for a little bit. Sorry, I should have given you a little bit of a warning on that 5-minute interlude. But this is your point, Zanele, right? That the panic is the initial reaction. Then getting knowledge, getting a realistic assessment of the situation, then allows you to say, okay, now what? And that, I think, is where the opportunity mindset can begin to exist, because you can't sit in limbo for the whole of 2020. We've got to start shifting. We've got to start pivoting how we think about life, our organizations, and hopefully at that point, the opportunity mindset begins to emerge.
Yeah. And it is about seeing that opportunity. And that's what calms a lot of that panic down, when we can see that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and what it looks like for us and what it looks like for our business. Because unless you change, there is almost no way that your business is going to survive this disruption that we're going through at the moment. And I mean, we've all seen the memes of Shakespeare and how he had written Macbeth in quarantine, but a lot of the data, and there's data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States.
Just hang on a little bit here. Now you're talking like a teacher, right? So you're talking like a teacher who says, we all know this stuff. I haven't heard of this. When was Shakespeare in quarantine? Come on, help me out here.
So there was a meme that went around as soon as most countries started to go into lockdowns, of different people that had innovated or come up with a lot of groundbreaking material.
Yeah, so Isaac Newton, for example, this was the bubonic plague, right? And Oxford University went into quarantine for a few weeks, and he came up with the theory of gravity at the time. Okay, so Shakespeare wrote Macbeth during quarantine.
Yes, that's what they say. Okay. So besides that, so the more real stuff, labor statistics research in the United States actually shows that companies like CNN and your Ubers and your Airbnbs were actually founded during times of dips in the economy.
Well, a lot of those were during the last depression in 2008, Uber and Airbnb and so on. And CNN in the previous one, I think in the end of the 1980s, early 1990s. So what you're saying is that often when deep disruption happens, it gives people an opportunity to think creatively and do something they might not normally have done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there is so much of this opportunity, but it all lies in unlearning the initial response, which is the response of panic, and then moving into the response that leads you to see the opportunity and then to start to seize it and to take advantage of it. So there is a lot of opportunity within times of crisis, and when we are initially panicking, what we need to do is rather move into seeing those opportunities, seeing the different ways that our businesses can take advantage of the changes. So what I was saying a little bit earlier is that if you do want a framework of any kind to start to see opportunity, I would strongly suggest using those fixedness 3 factors. So looking at the functional changes that have taken place as a result of whatever disruption you're finding yourself in, looking at the structural changes that have taken place, and then looking at relational changes that have taken place. And then you can even flip those changes into what are the functional, relational, and structural opportunities that we can start to see during this time. And I think that that's a great framework to start to work.
And you know what? We don't have to look back at history. And by the way, Vickers, thank you very much. That I've just had a quick scan of the article you sent through there. For those of you who want a little bit who history boffins and history fanatics, Vickers has put a really great link in the chat. Just make sure that you click on that to get that before the thing finishes. But there are fantastic examples of people doing this right now. So here in Johannesburg, I live in a suburb where a few years ago an ice cream company started, a company called Paul's Ice Cream. And they had a wonderful, innovative way of getting people interested in their ice cream. The first Sunday of every month, they would create a little pop-up restaurant in a car park somewhere, and they would take all of their ice creams to the car park. They'd only let you know a few hours in advance, and then you'd have to rush to this car park and go and buy their ice creams. And when they were sold out, they were sold out. It was just a little hobby on the side. Then it obviously became a little bit of a cult thing, and now there are Paul's shops in Rosebank and in Craigle Park and a few other places, and it's magnificent ice cream. It honestly is. So when going into lockdown, our family said, "How do we get Paul's ice cream?" And after a few days, Paul's ice cream came, and we all part of their mailing list and everything else, and said, well, obviously ice cream is not essential. Well, I mean, ice cream is essential, but from a government perspective, ice cream wasn't listed as an essential service. I don't know what the government was thinking. But Paul's had basically gone to the government and said, if we do deliveries of essential products, can we register as a delivery company? And the government said, of course you can. So now Paul's will deliver they do a breakfast package, which includes cereals and milk, probably Wheat Bix and so on, and ice cream. And then they have a cleaning package, where they're delivering hand sanitizers and soap and everything else, and ice cream. And so they're still selling their ice cream, and we can still buy their ice cream, but they've pivoted to become an essential delivery service. Simple example, but I think a brilliant example. One final example, last night our family did a wine tasting with the Jordan Wine Farm, and they're not allowed to deliver, obviously, alcohol, so you have to have for international people in South Africa, we're not allowed to buy alcohol at the moment. So internationally, you could buy the alcohol, get it delivered to you, and then join them in a wine tasting. I just happen to love Jordan so much, I had all of the wines already in stock at home. And so we joined them. But I wonder if after the lockdown is finished, and 3 years, 4 years from now, Jordan and other wine farms might still be doing wine tasting. And this comes to a question a few of you have asked, is this just a response to the crisis? Or are these three mindsets something that will help us ongoing? And I think the answer is that these are mindsets that will help us forever. And I think that some companies are going to use the crisis to change and then realize they like the change, and they might be changed forever.
Yeah. And remember that the rest of us are changed too. So the way we're responding to that business and the world around us will cause us to rather cling to the business that responds to this change that we've made. So we're better receptive of people that have pivoted as well, of businesses that have responded to the change. Very great point.
Very good point. So Zanele, you were going to just talk to us about, in closing, and we are watching the time. You were going to bring us back to those three areas and talk about the new normal, right?
Yes. So that's what I was about to do, just to wrap up, so we can open up the floor to some questions and some engagement. So in closing, and just to kind of wrap up, it really just is the understanding that this is the new normal. And whether it's COVID-19 normal that we're talking about, or it's a new normal that we're talking about that may come for your business at a later stage, because remember, it doesn't have to necessarily be global scale disruptions. Any kind of thing, occurrence that needs your business to pivot in some type of way is a disruption for you. So looking at the disruption as a new normal and understanding that instead of wishing for things to go back to the way they used to be, rather understanding that this is the way things are going to be. How do we begin to take advantage of that? Make the mindset shifts initially and then start to work from there. So understand what your forms of fixedness are. What is holding us back at this moment from moving from one normal to the next? Then once you have a better understanding of what's holding you back, then you can start to make that shift with those mindsets and then innovating in the end. So initially what I use this type of unlearning for is to help organizations to initially innovate, to open up their minds towards what they need to do and how they need to kind of pivot towards innovation. I loved your example of the ice cream, because it shows that functional fixedness may not have been a kind of blockage for that business, and they were able to actually move out of it, to say that why does our function need to be restricted? Why do we just need to be the guys that sell ice cream from a parking lot? That's not necessarily a box that we need to put ourselves in. As long as we understand the purpose of our business, the limits are completely endless as to what we can do.
Yeah. Zanele, Duke has asked a number of questions, and I'm going to just summarize them a little bit. Also, just sort of by way of wrapping up, we're going to finish on the hour, and so those of you who need to know to go, I know you've got places to go and people to meet and stuff to do. Okay, maybe other webinars to watch, but you can go on the hour. But Zanele and I don't have to rush away, so we'll stay and answer a few questions after the top of the hour. But Duke's given us a really great way to just summarize and close up here. We're not saying that you just need to throw everything out, start from scratch, disrupt everything, right? Unlearning is more about giving yourself and your team permission to ask, do we have to do it this way? And I think that's a question that a lot of people don't ask themselves. So the answer to the question might be yes. The way we've always done it is actually a jolly good way of doing it, and so that's fine. But it's about that permission, isn't it? And permission means giving yourself permission to ask it, but also organizationally allowing that conversation to happen. Is this the way it has to be done? For me, if we were to summarize everything we've been saying, you're getting down to giving yourself permission to asking that question. Would you agree with that, or am I being too simplistic?
Yes, I would agree. I was actually just tapping in the chat box. I always encourage the statement, there has to be another way. There has to be another way
of doing it. Yeah. And so, Duke, you asked whether techniques like Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats, maybe we should do a webinar on that. I love the 6 thinking hats. If you haven't heard of that, look it up. We won't go into detail now, but it's 6, in fact, it's 5 different ways to think about something. You look at the positives, what could go right. You look at the negatives, what could go wrong. You look at factual information, you look at emotional information, and you look at new creative ideas. Those are the 5 different ways. And then the 6th thinking hat, it kind of makes sure that each of the other 5 ways gets to be thought about and isn't ignored, and sort of manages the conversation. And then you've got design thinking, and there's a whole lot of different techniques. So unlearning isn't a technique itself, it's just an attitude. It's an attitude which says, let's find some techniques to allow us to ask, is there another way? Could we do this differently? Is the way we've always done it the only way that we could do it? And giving ourselves permission, first of all, but then tools to actually look at things in a different way.
I like what Andrew says about leadership, that leadership needs to be open to staff asking questions and continuously challenging the current ways of doing things. And it really does need to start there. It starts with us opening them up, but leadership really does need to start to be open to the organization actually changing and being challenged.
I would go even further, Zanele, to say that, often people who are promoted to leadership or leadership positions think that their job now is to answer the questions. Whereas I think that it's the opposite way around. And I know you're passionate about this as well, helping leaders to learn how to ask better questions. And not questions like, why didn't you do what I told you? That's not a great question. But questions that get unlearning happening. So it isn't just about giving permission to ask the odd question. It's about actually driving that question asking process yourself if you're a leader.
Precisely. I'm just going to copy and paste something about the 6 thinking hats here that I see.
Go for it. Then just one final point within our hour that summarizes all of this. Then Zanele, I'll give you a chance just to summarize, and then those who need to leave can, and the rest of us can stick around and answer some questions. For me, the big the reason I really wanted to have this conversation with you, Zanele, today is I just know that this concept of unlearning is going to be useful for people. Because right now, you said it right at the beginning, but I'm just going to reiterate it. We are never going back to normal. If you're sitting at home now, you're watching this webinar, you're thinking, when am I going to get back to normal? When will the government release the lockdown so that I can go back to work and get back to doing my job and getting back to normal? It's not going to happen. Normal as we know it is over. A new normal will emerge. But what that gives us is a literally once in a lifetime. Let's hope this doesn't happen again, right? It gives us a once in a lifetime moment. By moment, I mean probably a year or two. But it gives us this moment in history where we have a blank slate like we have never and will never have again. This is true for you personally. You can start to build new habits right now while you're in lockdown. If you haven't been exercising enough, and you'd like to start exercising, you don't wait till the end of lockdown, you start now. Those of you who got home and you had told yourself, there are things I wish I'd done in my house. And the only reason I didn't do them is because I didn't have time. Well, you're proving yourself wrong now, right? If you haven't done those things yet, you're never going to do them. So don't wait to go back to normal. If there are things you want to change in your life, and then, of course, if there are things you want to change in your business, in your company, in your industry, as we come into the second half of 2020, when will you have a better opportunity to change things, to do things differently, to make suggestions to your boss? If you're not the boss, when is going to be a better opportunity to make suggestions to your boss about changes than right now? So once you're over the crisis, panic thinking, get into the opportunity mindset and use this unlearning opportunity to make change that will last the rest of our lifetimes. There ends my preach, Zanele, but you get the last word in the official webinar.
No, thank you very much, Graham. I see we've gone over the hour, so I won't take too much time. I just want to encourage that this conversation goes on. I mean, I'm also in lockdown, so I will have an opportunity to read emails and to engage with people who want to further talk about this topic and just to engage. Let me know how this is going for you. The webinar recording will be available, so please feel free to share that with individuals that will potentially benefit from this. So those are my details on screen, my website, email address, and anything else also available on social media to keep this conversation going. I think there's never been a better time to change. There's never been a better time to unlearn and to start to make those changes going forward.
Thank you for all of your thank yous, everybody. We've appreciated doing this. So if you need to go. But Zanele, I don't need to go. We can, you and I can stick around for a few minutes. If there are any other questions, I'm just going to scroll back down now to just see if there are any questions that we haven't picked up. Otherwise, if you had a question you wanted to ask us that we didn't answer, drop it into the chat box right now. Loredana, I think, or Lordana has said education will never be the same again. I know, Zanele, you and I are both passionate about education. You were a teacher previously. You know what, I couldn't agree more that their education is going to, I think, be one of the industries that leads the way. I hope it does, in terms of showing everybody else how much can change. I know a lot of teachers who have said, no, you can't do virtual lessons, you know. Every single teacher in the world has to handcraft and custom design a lesson for tomorrow and present it. And it's only when you're a very lazy teacher, or if you are off sick, that we pull out a screen and we show children a video, you know that. But I'm old enough to remember when they would wheel in a TV and a VHS when you know you're don't laugh at me, Zanele.
I had that too.
But you know, that was when your teacher was off sick and it was a rubbish class. I think teachers and students who have access to technology. Let's be clear, not all teachers and students have access, but those who do might discover that actually you can do quite a lot on a virtual environment. And as you said earlier, it was a really good point. It's not just companies that are changing, it's all the customers and clients of those companies that are changing too. I think education travel will be something else that will change forever. We don't need to travel as much as we thought we needed to. Most of us are going to discover that's true as well. So I don't know. What's your thoughts around education and some of your teacher friends? Are you guys already talking and thinking about how this might change things?
I think they are, but a lot of teachers are quite frustrated about this, and because they hadn't actually opened themselves up to the prospect that things could be different. This is where the trouble usually starts, is when you don't open yourself up that things could potentially be different. And the best piece of advice that I've heard so far is that now we're going to need to start to think virtually first. So virtual, whoever and whatever you are, and whatever you do, whether you're the client or you're the actual business, you need to think virtual first, and then face-to-face will then follow on in your systems, in the way you carry things out. Think about how you can install systems that could make your work happen flawlessly online without you being physically present. And then you can give your clients the other option. But we're moving into now a space more quickly. I think most people saw this change happening in about 10 years. We've literally just shrunken all of this lovely innovation into such a short space of time. To think virtual first. And I think this education is where we're going to start to see this. Another important point you made is it's still about access. It's still about access. And the part that pains me as well is that we might only see this gap of haves and haves not getting a little bit bigger as well. But let's see how it happens.
Well, I'm hopeful, Zanele, that we come out the other side of this having different conversations in the world space.
Yeah.
You know, that we realize we can't leave as many people behind in the new global system and the new technology paradigms and the digital world, and we can't just leave as many people behind as we have been, and that we are literally with COVID-19 all in this together. And that's one of the unlearnings that we need. But that might lead nicely to Michael Neal. Michael has added something. He says he does a little bit of work around helping people overcome addiction, and is interested in our comments on whether unlearning and relearning and addiction, if there's anything that we can learn from the addiction side. I must say it's not something I'm hugely familiar with, except in watching movies and things. I haven't had to personally deal with overcoming addiction, but I could imagine that some of the techniques you might use, the 12 steps or whatever of Alcoholics Anonymous, they might be quite useful in how to unlearn old habits and put in place new habits. So that might definitely be worth looking at. I don't know if you have any perspective on that.
I strongly agree with that. And I was actually thinking about the habits side of it. Is that literally at the end of the day, it's all habits. A thought pattern is a habit, because you've created it and then you've recreated it and then you've continuously traveled it. So it becomes some form of habit. And the very same thing that happens in your mind with addiction will happen when you try to change any other kind of behavior. Yes, Graham.
Yeah. One of the things that seems to me that recovering addicts do, or probably there's 2 or 3 things as I think about it now that might be useful in the unlearning space, is there's accountability. So you don't try and do it alone. You get help. There's transparency. There's this deep openness to say, I am an addict. I'm struggling with my old patterns. I acknowledge that, and it's been 33 days since I've had a drink or whatever. I wonder if some of those techniques are going to be useful after lockdown. Hi, I'm a leader with control issues, and it's been 12 hours since I last shouted at one of my employees. But it's an interesting one, Michael. I'm definitely going to think about it more and look into it more, where some of those steps around overcoming addiction might be things useful for us as we overcome the addiction to the old way of doing things in our offices.
I'm just reading some of the comments. Duke, I'm reading what Did you pick up any other questions, Graham, that we can?
There was a question, wait, I'm going to have to go and find it, where I said to Ian that he asked a question, which was a great question, but I thought we would come back to it. So I'm just going to have to quickly find that. But I think it might have gone down in the timeline. Ian, if you're still watching, please remind us of what your question was, because we didn't come back to it and I can't see it in the timeline. That's there. Otherwise, I think we've answered pretty much everything that was asked, either directly answered it or sort of picked it up in our conversations.
Yes.
Any final questions, guys? You've got a minute or two now to quickly throw in your final questions.
Please email these questions if you can.
Yeah, or email them. Just a reminder to connect with us. We are not going anywhere. You going out today at all, Zanele? Got anything to do?
Just the usual. Staying
running
around in my garden.
Okay, guys, we'll call it quits there. Thank you so much for spending an hour or so with us. We really appreciate it. We hope it's been useful. Please feel free to share this. Remember, go to tomorrowtodayglobal.com/webinars. We've come to the end of our first series of those webinars. We'll let you have information when we set up the next series, which will be in a week's time or so. We're doing work at the moment around trying to understand this disruption and help it make sense for our clients and for people like yourselves. Zanele, thank you for your time today and for your expertise around unlearning. And yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.